haven't been here before, we have a whole variety of public programs about different aspects of New York City history. You can look us up on the web, the W's, gothamcenter.org. The next event in this spring season will be on June 16th in this room. It'll be called New York Stories. It's being done in conjunction with the New York Times. They have a new book coming out on the Best of the City section of the Times, and there'll be a bunch of writers, Philip Lopate, Vivian Gornick, Tom Beller, Laura Cunningham, others. Tonight should be serious fun. It's on New York in the 1970s, the pre-gentrification years, and I'm just going to introduce the players and give you a sense of how we're going to arrange the evening. We're going to start with Phil Hartman, who is the co-founder, owner of the Two Boots Empire, which includes the restaurants, the video store, and the Pioneer Theater. And he's also the founder and curator of the Howl Festival put on by FIVA, the Federation of East Village Artists. And he's going to say a few words and introduce an excerpt about 9-10 minutes from his film, No Picnic. Then Mark Jacobson, who is the author of the book that's outside and is available for sale afterwards, and Mark will be delighted to scribble in it. The book is Teenage Hipster in the Modern World from Grove Press. He's also the author of 12,000 Miles in the Nick of Time, a semi-dysfunctional family circumnavigates the globe, and the novels Gojiro and Everyone and No One. He has been a contributing editor to Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, Esquire, and New York. And Mark really helped put this event together and is going to moderate the discussion. Then Michael Daly is going to make some other kind of introductory remarks. He's a Daily News columnist. He is the first American born in his family, and he attended 16 grammar schools. He graduated from Yale University. He started journalism at Flatbush Life. He has published one novel, Underground. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 daughters. Then the panelists who are going to discuss the various themes that are popped up include Legs McNeil, who is the co-founder of Punk Magazine and co-author of Please Kill Me, the uncensored oral history of punk rock. He is a former editor at Spin and Nerve, and he wrote Marilyn Chambers' comeback film, Still Insatiable. He lives in Pennsylvania. John Holstrom, cartoonist and co-founder of Punk Magazines, the former editor and publisher of High Times and publisher of Nerve Magazine. Gillian McCain is the co-author of Please Kill Me. She was the program coordinator of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church, the editor of the Poetry Project newsletter, and currently serves on the board of directors. In 1997, she was awarded 3rd place at the Ralph Gleason Music Book Award. At present, she is co-writing with Legs McNeil a screenplay adaptation of their book, Please Kill Me, for Jersey Films. Lenny Kaye is the guitarist with the Patti Smith Band. Guitarist, songwriter, producer, record collector, rock historian, and music critic. It was Kaye whose writings and guitar playing inspired a then fledgling poet, playwright, actress named Patti Smith to put her words to music on February 10th, 1971, when he joined her for what we'd now call a spoken word performance at St. Mark's Church. That partnership quickly blossomed into the Patti Smith Group, one of the most important bands to come out of New York in the 1970s. Fab Five Freddy was born Fred Braithwaite. After graduating high school in the late 70s, he went on to study painting at Medgar Evers College. His most famous subway painting, done in 1979 with Lee Quinones, was a tribute to Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans. His work gained the attention of art dealers. His paintings have been displayed worldwide with the likes of Keith Haring, Lee Quinones, and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Fred helped introduce America and the world to hip-hop culture. He collaborated with Charlie Ahern on the 1982 classic hip-hop film Wild Style. Freddy was musical director of the film and also starred in it along with other artists such as Lee, Lady Pink, Africa Bambaataa, and others. He was part of the first hip-hop tour to Europe with Africa Bambaataa, Rocksteady Crew, Futura 2000, Dondi, and others. Fred directed music videos for KRS-One, Shabba Ranks, Queen Latifah, and others. I think it is over to Phil.
Well, I've picked out a short clip. It's about 9 minutes in the middle of this film. I think that you may not know exactly what's going on narratively, but you'll get a flavor of the neighborhood. I know this is a panel about New York in the 70s. This film was shot in the summer of '85. But you can make a case that the 70s ended in the East Village anyway in the summer of '85. And I think it's actually in the first shot you're going to see. You'll see a tube coming out of the building with a lot of dust and debris that a building's being renovated. That's the Christodora House, and the Christodora House became a symbol of the end of the 70s and gentrification in the East Village. That's where the Times Square riots culminated when the kids in the park attacked the lobby of this gentrified building. So that's in the first shot here. You'll also see that there's quite a bit of art in lots of shots on the street. And even though at the time, I think like a lot of people, I was revolted by how much art was everywhere. You had a drink at a bar, there was art hanging in a restaurant, wherever you were, there was art, art, art. But now looking back on it, I certainly feel incredibly wistful that there's so much street art in here, so much fantastic public art. So keep your eyes open, there's art all over the place. The film's being re-released this summer for its 20th anniversary, so if you like these 9 minutes, you can see the rest of it.
Okay, now could we ask our panelists to, in fact, drag the tables out of the way over to the side so they can sit and watch?
Number 2 pencils and
That's true. There's going to be a test on this material, especially for you. Hi, I'm Mark Jacobson. Well, I don't know. I've been elected to be the moderator of the panel, I guess. But recently I have this book come out here. It's like, I don't want to call them my greatest hits, but it's a collection of my pieces over the past 30 years or so. And several of them were written actually in the 1970s.
imagine that.
It's hideous, isn't it? See, I remember when Legs didn't have that bald spot or any of that stuff. Anyhow, I'm gonna. You're still late. So I'm gonna read a little bit of. So New York City in the 1970s was. We like to think of it as a semi-apocalyptic landscape, which was either a cartoon of the apocalypse or the actual apocalypse, depending on how you're looking at it. So here's a little taste of the uptown apocalypse. This is from a piece called The Haint of Harlem. A haint is another name for a ghost or a kind of a spirit. And the subtitle is The Nasty Life and Times of Frank Lucas. Now, Frank Lucas was a singular figure of the 1970s. He was a huge, massive drug dealer in Harlem. If anybody remembers Nicky Barnes, this guy's like bigger than him, but not as well known because that's the way he wanted it. He's still living. He lives over in Newark, and somehow, I don't know how he's still living, but he still is. In any event, I'm going to read a little bit of this. It says, during the 1970s, when for a graffiti-splashed early disco moment of urban time, he was, according to the then U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, the biggest drug dealer in Harlem, Frank Lucas would sit at the corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue in a beat-up Chevrolet he called Nellie Bell. Then residing in a swank apartment in Riverdale down the hall from Yvonne DiCarlo, and running his heroin business out of a suite at the Regency Hotel on Park Avenue, Lucas owned several cars. He had a Rolls, a Mercedes, a Stingray, and a 427 four-on-the-floor muscle job that he'd once topped out at 160 miles an hour near the exit 16E of the Jersey Turnpike, scaring him so silly that he gave the car to his brother's wife just to get it out of his sight. But as for spying, Nellie Bell worked best. Well, Frank has got this singular voice, which I'm not going to try to imitate here, but it's like this. Who would ever think I'd be sitting in a shit $300 car like that, asked Lucas, who claims that on a good day he would clear up to $1 million selling dope on 116th Street. I'd sit there, cap pulled down, with a fake beard, dark glasses, maybe some army fatigues and a broken down boots and a long hair wig. I'd be right up beside the people dealing my stuff, watching the whole show, and nobody knew who I was. It was a matter of control and trust. As leader of the Country Boys dope ring, Frank, older brother to Ezel, Vernon Lee, John Paul, Larry, and Lee Lucas, was known for restricting his operation to blood relatives and others from his rural North Carolina backwoods where he grew up. This was because, Lucas said in his down-home creak of a voice, a country boy, he ain't hip. He's not used to big cars, fancy ladies, diamond rings, so he'll be loyal to you. A country boy, you can give him $1 million, $5 million, and tell him to hide it in his old shack. His wife and kids might be hungry, starving, and he'll never touch any of your money till he checks with you. A city boy, he ain't like that. A city boy will take your last dime and look you straight in the face and swear he ain't got it. A city boy will steal from you in a New York minute, and you've got to be able to deal with it in a New York second. You don't want a city boy. The son of a bitch just ain't no good. But trust has its limits, even among country boys, Frank says. 116th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue was mine. It belonged to me. I bought it, I ran it, I owned it. And when something is yours, you've got to be Johnny on the spot, ready to take it to the top. So I sit in front of the Roman Garden restaurant or around the corner by the Royal Flush Bar, just watching. It wouldn't be much to see until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when Frank's brand of heroin, Blue Magic, hit the street. During the early 1970s, there were many brands of dope in Harlem. There was True Blue, Mean Machine, Could Be Fatal, Dick Down, Booty, Coolie High, Capone, Ding Dong, Fuck Me, Fuck You, Nice, Nice to Be Nice, Oh, Can't Get Enough of That Funky Stuff, Tragic Magic, Gerber, The Judge, 32, 3220, OD, Correct, Official Correct, Past Due, Payback, Revenge, Green Tape, Red Tape, Swear to God, Rush, Praise, 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 Kill, 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 Killer 1, Killer 2, KKK, Good Pussy, Taster's Choice, Harlem Hijack, Joint and Insured for Life and Insured for Death are just a few of the brand names rubber stamped upon the celebrating bags, but none sold like Blue Magic. That's because with Blue Magic you can get 10% purity, Frank asserts. With any other you got 5%, you were doing good. Mostly it was 3. We put it out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the cops changed shifts. That gave you a couple of hours to work before those lazy bastards got down there. My buyers, though, you could set your watch by them. Those junkies crawling out. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we had enough niggers in the street to make a Tarzan movie. His words, not mine. They had to reroute the bus coming down 8th Avenue to 116th Street. It just couldn't get through. Call the transit department and see if it's not so. On a usual day, we put out maybe 25,000 quarters. A quarter is a spoon, $50 worth, enough to get high for the rest of the day. By 9 o'clock, I ain't got a fucking gram. Everything is gone, sold, and I got myself $1 million. I just sit there in Nellie Bell and watch the money roll in, says Frank, of those not-so-distant but near-forgotten days when Abe Beam would lay his pint-sized head upon the pillow at Gracie Mansion and the cop cars were still green and black. And nobody even knew it was me. I was a shadow, a ghost, what we call down home a haint. That was me, the haint of Harlem. Now, Mr. Lucas, the reason why I got kind of interested in him is that he did one singular thing which people old enough might remember. This is one of the great metaphors of the Vietnam War. He became famous because he went to Bangkok by himself wearing his Superfly outfit and set up a connection out there because he didn't want to deal with the Italians who he didn't like. So he went to Bangkok and he went up to the Golden Triangle and made this deal for himself. And he smuggled some of the heroin back in the body bags of the dead American soldiers, which I always thought was like, wow. Who would have thought of that? Anyhow, so that's like uptown in the 1970s. Now, downtown in the 1970s. I'm going to read this little part here because it's the title piece of this book, Teenage Hipster in the Modern World. It's the name of this book. And it comes from an article that was written in the Village Voice. What year was that? from the Village Voice, 1978. 1978, 27 years ago. And this piece was about two of the panelists there, the guy with the bald head and the other looking scruffy guy over there. And it was basically about this movement of the beginning of the movement of punk music and this kind of sense of teenagers moving to New York in this kind of like bombed out landscape of the Lower East Side and the Bowery. This is even before CBGB's became famous. I mean, it was just about when it was becoming famous. So there's three characters here, Mr. Holstrom, Mr. McNeil, and another guy named Jed Dunn, who has now passed from the scene, I guess. Anyhow, so to save Legs, Holstrom, and Dunn decided to move to New York and start a magazine. At first, Holstrom wanted to call the magazine Teenage News because they were only interested in teenage issues. But it was eventually changed to Punk because Legs was a big fan of the Dictator's song Weekend. It goes, Eddie is the local punk, throwing up and getting drunk, eating in McDonald's for lunch. And since Eddie is actually Legs, his actual real name is Roderick Edwin McNeil.
Edward.
Edward?
Thanks.
Edwin?
No.
You mean this is incorrect?
Yeah.
That's terrible.
You're not as good as you think you are.
You know, so it just shows the quality of fact-checking at the Village Voice in 1978.
That's right.
You know?
Blame it on Mark was just trying to humiliate me even more.
Hey, just shut up. You'll get the chance. You'll get a chance to talk. Just be quiet. I know. Dunn, the budding capitalist who compared Punk magazine's mimeograph machine to a Carl Sandburg steel mill, became the publisher. Holstrom, a genius cartoonist and Harvey Kurtzman disciple, made himself the editor. Legs, however, couldn't figure out what he wanted to call himself. He couldn't draw and had no head for business. Finally decided on the Resident Punk, which was a combination secret agent / Alfred E. Newman title, calculated to make him a legend by age 19. At last, Legs was cool. It was the end of 1974, the beginning of the CBGB punk emergence, that Punk magazine would help turn into a national media phenomenon. Legs was key on the scene. Any night you can see him in front of CBGB's with a loose cigarette hanging from his lower lip. Two punkette groupies on either arm of his leather jacket, the one with the rips under the arms, cutting a wicked figure. Big deal if you read few to no books. That's not true anymore, but it was then. That the entire reign of the Enlightenment seemed to be falling away in the Bowery soot. Those days, Legs' brain cooked like a burning idea factory. On the Bowery, he met other suburban kids who had suffered the uncertainty of cool through their early teenage years. Kids who had racked their brains for an answer to the question of how to be cool in an uncool time. Many of them, like the Ramones and the members of the Blondie Band and the Dictators, had come to the same conclusions that Legs had and thrown themselves headlong into the study of what was called the modern world. Legs spent those early CBGB nights discoursing Bullwinkle Moose and TV commercials with Joey Ramone, and sometimes even with Dee Dee Ramone when the bassist was not too stoned or scary with his male hustler act. To Legs, these conversations had the momentous freshness of Mao and Joe and Lai revealing their similar passions for ideas by the light of one candle in a cave. One night, Legs found out that he, Joey, Holstrom, and two members of the Blondie Band all had the same dream. They dreamed that Monty Hall was saying, people remember who Monty Hall is? He was the host of a TV show called Let's Make a Deal. And you used to have this thing in your hand, and there was a curtain over there, and you were asked to make this decision about whether or not you would trade what you had for what might be behind that curtain, right? And the dream was, well, would you trade your entire life for what's behind that curtain? After that, Legs knew his generation, the first ever to grow up completely within the modern age, had acquired a huge collective subconscious. Often he would sit in the back of CBGB's listening to the talking heads sing Don't Worry About the Government, or make up his famous persons interviews for Punk. Legs did straight Q&As with personalities like Boris and Natasha and the cast of Gilligan's Island. Coming from a difficult home life, he poignantly and also insanely wrote long letters seeking parental advice from father figures like Carl Betts of the Donna Reed Show. I remember the day Milton Glaser came by my desk at New York Magazine, which is where I was working at the time, and picked up an issue of Punk magazine. He thought, people remember, Milton Glaser was a guy, was a famous 60s graphic artist, an icon. He made that Bob Dylan poster with a Technicolor hair and a whole bunch of other stuff. He was a big deal. He thumbed through it, and looking at the hand-printed features, it was Holstrom's master stroke that made Punk the best magazine of the neo-literate times. He made the whole thing look like a comic book. That way he could print the theory of relativity and the kids would still read it. The illustrated interviews, he saw the illustrated interviews with Lou Reed and all the other things they put in there. Glaser sat down, visibly shaken. These guys could put me out of business, he said. If Punk worried Milton Glaser, I knew here was something big. Anyhow, I'm going to read one little last section here to get this whole thing started. This is from a piece called Sleaze Out on East 14th Street, from the Annals of Pre-Gentrification. And it's a long piece about 14th Street as it was in 1977, with a lot of kind of inklings about what it would later become. And there's a paragraph in here which I'd like you to think about. Anybody who really knows New York City then and now might find it somewhat resonant. I've always wanted to write a story called The 10 Sleaziest Street Corners in New York. I mean, why do certain street corners, excluding the obvious ghetto area ones, become hangouts for pill pushers, prostitutes, winos, bums, creeps, cripples, mental patients, mumblers, flim-flam men, plastic flower sellers, peep show operators, head case, panhandlers, and other socially unacceptable neither-world types? Why did these corners get this way? How long have they been this way? What was their future? Which ones had McDonald's? Which ones had Burger Kings? Did it matter? I compiled a fairly comprehensive list off the top of my head. 96th and Broadway, first subway stop down from Harlem. 72nd Street and Broadway, good old Needle Park. 53rd and 3rd, the Ramones sang a song about chicken hawking there. 28th and Park Avenue South, the Belmore Cafeteria, where the cab drivers used to hang out then, used to bring a lot of hookers. 2nd Avenue and St. Mark's Place, the dregs of burned-out hippies. The Bowery in Houston, the cabbies used to run over a bum before they let him wash their windshield. 6th Avenue and 8th Street, the aggressively plastic up-and-comer. This is an anomaly, 90th Street and Roosevelt Avenue in Queens, the home of the low-level Colombian coat dealer. And of course, the granddaddy of them all, 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. In fact, the entire 40 Deuce complex. Now, if you think about these places, what they were then and what they are now, that's basically what we're talking about, because things have changed. So we're going to start our panel discussion here. Well, I don't know. Why don't we, this is Michael Daly.
You want to start with legs?
Want to start with, legs, since like,
Start with his.
yeah, rebuttal. Well, actually, let's
Start with
What?
Edwin there.
Edwin. Well, actually, let's this is Fab Five Freddy, and maybe you guys could talk a little bit about the how the punk thing and the hip hop thing, the early days of both, how they were different and how they were the same. That work?
Sure.
Okay.
First of all, I didn't know that Fab Five Freddy toured with African Bambaataa.
Yeah, it wasn't. I guess it wasn't so much a tour, but I guess it was. It was such an early period, but it was the first big tour where hip hop culture went over to Europe. It was mostly France, a couple of gigs in England, but in terms of hip hop, as people know it and see it now, the graffiti, the breakdancing, the DJing, and the rapping, it was like we all went over there together, and Bambaataa and a bunch of DJs and Rocksteady crew and some graffiti artists. So we did it all simultaneously on the show. But
Thanks for taking me.
yeah.
I could have come along.
But I don't know. I guess as far for me, I mean, I was, I guess, a part of me getting things rolling were hooking up with some people that were very involved in punk or new wave, particularly Blondie, who, I used to consider it like a cultural exchange. I mean, I I had seen some of the magazines. I might have seen Punk magazine early on in my neighborhood where I grew up in Bed-Stuy. There was a little candy store, magazine store that had a bunch of crazy magazines, and I remember seeing images of punk and different bands, you know, the Sex Pistols, stuff from England, stuff from here about the Dolls, and I'd read about this stuff, and I'd see graffiti. I remember seeing images of CBGBs. There was graffiti around on the walls, and I thought, you know, I had some ideas about graffiti as art, about this being more than just what it was, which was something that covered almost every space in the city, moving or standing still, and I thought there was something there. And when I met guys like Chris Stein and Debbie Harry from Blondie and visited CBGB's, they were totally into those ideas, and I eventually took them to the Bronx to see hip-hop in the Raw at a PAL, actually, 183rd and Webster. But this was, I guess for me, my 70s was, you know, a kid coming off the streets of Bed-Stuy, having some ideas about things that I just, you know, playfully imagined could and maybe should happen. And a key thing for me was meeting people like, you know, Chris and Debbie, and going to CBGBs and seeing bands and just feeling that raw energy and seeing that there was something very similar in the energy going on in hip-hop in the streets at that time, you know, graffiti and just that whole raw energy. I saw something similar, and that happened as a result of me hooking up with those people.
Yeah, I think what Freddy's describing is kind of our same experience, that we found New York very, very open, and you could kind of imagine yourself in these great scenarios, you know? And it really was kind of abandoned, wasn't it? And didn't it feel like a big movie set, and you could just go in and, you know, be a rap guy or a punk guy, but there was a lot of, I think, imagining yourself where you wanted to be, you know, because everything was so, it was like this movie set, and no one wanted to be in New York anymore, you know, I found, you know, and it was kind of like they abandoned this movie set, and you could just, you know, go crazy. It was great, you know. I don't know what John,
Well, I think a lot of us moved here because there were cheap rents.
yeah.
You know, a friend of mine, I went to school of visual arts in 73, 74, and one of my classmates was daring enough to live on Avenue D, and he got a 4-room apartment for $30 a month. And my first job was at a place called Charis, and that became pretty well known later on. They got chased out of a public school, but in 72, they had a deal with the city, and they were renting a floor-through loft, probably 1.5 to 2 times the size of this room, for $15 a month. They got a second loft above that, which was their workshop, for an additional $5 a month. And then they had a back lot, like an entire city block, where they could build things. That was, I think, another $5 a month. Granted, they had a deal with the city, but still, this gives you an idea of how inexpensive it was to live in New York and why so many people lived here. But now you have the opposite thing happening. Everybody's being chased out because they can't afford to live here anymore. But I think graffiti was a big influence on everyone, because you take the subway, and these cars would roll in, and you'd see some guy who made a masterpiece on like 3 cars in a
I know,
row.
it was amazing.
Beautiful,
Yeah,
and it was inspiring. Unfortunately, it looked like a lot of the great artists left the scene by the late 70s, because then you started getting just a lot of small tags, and it didn't look quite so great. That might have been due to police pressure, too. I don't know.
When I lived down on Staten Island, there was a crew of graffiti guys that would go out, you know, and they were really cool, you know. I don't know, it seemed like you could steal from any culture and go here and there and do things, and steal some from this guy's, and, you know, you could take what you wanted and build it, and, you know, I don't know.
I think I remember, you probably know him, Steve Hager.
Steve Hager, yes.
Good friend of mine, yeah.
Yeah,
He
I
did a
worked with
great
him
book
at,
on the rap, which I
Yeah.
thought was great.
Well, Steve Hager was an interesting guy, because I know you said Mike's with the Daily News, and Steve Hager was a guy that wrote back then. This was actually 1980, and he wrote for the Daily News, and I curated, once, you know, I'm kind of ingrained on the scene now through my relationships with, Glenn O'Brien and Debbie Harry and all these kind of people. So I was able to get into certain spots that were cool, like the Mud Club. And, I was a painter at the time and was doing a lot of that while trying to figure out how to get the money to make Wild Style. And Keith Haring introduced me to Steve Mast that owned the Mud Club, and they asked me to curate a show there. There was going to be a show I called Beyond Words, which was graffiti based, rooted, and inspired work. And along with some of the usual suspects that painted trains like Lee, Crash, Days, and Futura, I got people like, Alan Vega from Suicide and, other people that I thought their work had a graffiti inspiration in terms of the energy. Well, anyway, Steve Hager wrote about that show, and he got word of it and wrote a huge piece. And it was like, back then when anybody mentioned graffiti, it was always, like in the worst terms possible. But he wrote this glowing piece about that show, and a huge amount of people came to the opening. And not long after, Steve, I think, lost his job at the paper, and then wrote what actually is the first book on hip-hop.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
it's
was,
really good.
It was incredible. Steve really gets it, and then edited High Times for quite a while. So
Actually, Michael, why don't you talk a little bit about the other side of that, which is New York City used to be known as Fear City during the 1970s. They had like, they used to have this symbol of, you could buy these T-shirts with these pistol on it, and it said, "Welcome to Fear City," which now you don't have that. But, well, how did it look like? How do you think all this graffiti and his punks look to people that were not part of the scene?
I don't, I thought it was the bodies that was the big problem. But I went around with a crime scene guy one week when we went to 36 murders in a weekend. And there was one scene where there were two guys lying shot in the street, and everybody was around a new car because it had bullet holes in it. And they were all upset because someone shot up the car. And, you thought it was, the level of violence was so terrible at times that you thought, that you were covering a war. It was a great time. It was a good time to be bad. They had one day up in the Bronx, anybody pled guilty to murder got zipped to 3. And it was the era of what the police called misdemeanor homicides, meaning that if you weren't killed in Manhattan below 125th Street, that it really didn't count. But the one big lesson I learned in that 70s, I think, was a night I was with another writer, Dennis Hamill. We were in a bar in Park Slope, which was still Irish. And the place was nicknamed Bar Wars for obvious reasons. And it's now a Chinese restaurant, but the lights went out. So we figured, well, we better go see what's going on. So we got in a car. And not too long afterwards, and actually everybody was very nice. There were no traffic lights. It was kind of after you, and everybody was pretty nice. And then we got to Broadway, and there were maybe 200,000 people stealing. And they were chanting, "Broadway, Broadway, Broadway." And they were taking cars, and they would tie the window grate to the bumper, the back bumper, and then they'd drive the car across the street and crash it into the store across the street. So that way they were opening up 2 stores at once. First thing that got stolen was Pampers. The next thing that got hit were the layaway places, because they really hated those places. And that's where the first fires started. And there wasn't a single person hurt. You had 200,000-300,000 people stealing, looting. The precinct over there, one cop had a great line. He said, no one got hurt. He said, you got to have a free hand to hurt somebody. And the next day, they had these huge sales on the roofs of all the buildings with, if you wanted to go buy TVs or something, they were all set out. You could get like a nice color TV for $25, and there were remarkable moments that they hit a car dealership, so there was like a parade down Broadway with all the girls waving out the windows of the new cars. A bunch of cops were chasing some kids out of an aquarium, and the kids dropped the thing, and the cops all stopped to try to save the fish. And but out of that, the next morning when you walked up there, it was all shattered, and the fires were still going, and but nobody got hurt, and it made you think that somehow I felt better about the city after that, because it put the violence in a kind of frame where you could kind of understand where it came from. And it's kind of like, well, you know, if you gave everybody what they wanted one night, you know, nobody'd get hurt, you know. And so I started feeling better about the town after that, but then the violence resumed, and but it was still, I mean, but you still miss, like, if you're as old as I am, you still, like, I was walking with my daughter at 42nd 8th the other day, and there used to be a Popeye's fried chicken there. And,
Church.
no, there was a Popeye's there.
Church.
There was a Popeye's there. And I used to sit there with Jack Maple, who was a transit cop who later went on and transformed the city of New York, and Wade Richardson, who was a cop who became a stockbroker. And the one night we sat there, and Wayne went to the joke store, and he loaded up this pack of Newports with exploding loads and all the cigarettes. And we sat there, and guys would come in, give me one of them fucking cigarettes, take the cigarette, light it up, it'd blow up in their face. And everybody would laugh, and they'd start getting mad, and Jackie said, no, 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 just sit down, because we're going to keep doing this all night. Pretty soon we had about 50 people, the scariest people in the city of New York, all waiting for the next guy to come in and get the cigarette and blow up in his face. Instead of that, now you got Chevys. So, you know. But I tell you that the Maple went on, and one way you can understand the violence in the 70s is what changed things, is that he was this fat transit cop who became deputy police commissioner, and he created something called ComStat. And what that meant was that every 2 weeks, the police commander, even in the toughest parts of Brooklyn, would have to go in, and every crime would appear on the screen, and he'd have to explain what he did about all those crimes. So suddenly, crimes that occurred on Halsey Street in Brooklyn were treated as seriously as crimes that occurred in Central Park South, and all of a sudden, the violence was cut by half. But I'll stop talking.
Actually, so, I mean, the stuff that Legs and John and Freddy and Michael talking about, I mean, now it just seems like that time is kind of like a good or bad dream, depending on how you feel about it. I was saying, it's like, Gillian, you weren't exactly there, but you're familiar with the myth.
Yeah.
And also Lenny, I mean, Lenny is like coming from a safe place, like you're a little older than these guys, right? So like, you come out of somewhat, well, a little bit. You come out of it like, you have a different grounding about that, you know, maybe you could also, after, you know, you guys talk about how you thought it started to change.
Sure. Well, I didn't move here till 1987, and I grew up in a small town in Canada. And speaking of Steve Hager, there was a great book, Art After Midnight, which you're in. And that was the first time I'd heard of Legs and John. There was a picture someone had taken. You guys were getting photographed for a Rolling Stone magazine in that book. But it's a great book all about the East Village, and it starts out with CBGBs, and then the graffiti, the rap, the East Village art scene. So everything I knew about New York came from mainly magazines, some movies, some books, but mainly magazines. Even Time magazine and Newsweek, there'd be like an article on the East Village, and it just looked so ominous and so cool. So when I moved here, I feel like New York was still kind of going on, but just the changes just since the early 90s are just unbelievable. My husband and I were watching King of Comedy last night, and we were like, we miss Chock full of Nuts. You know, I never went to Chock full of Nuts when they were around, but I really miss them now. But, you want to speak here? Oh, I don't know what else to say. Oh, I want to say that I've got your record with Blondie. I still do, in Canada, in the closet I grew up in. And I used to look at Lenny's picture on the back of the Patti Smith records, and that's the kind of things that made me want to move to New York.
I'm glad I made you want to move to New York. Quite an addition.
Did you read Rock Scene in Canada?
No, but Cream and Rolling Stone.
Oh, sorry, Doc Rock.
We couldn't get that.
I was born in New York up by the George Washington Bridge in the late 40s, so I probably am older than at least some of the people here. I think the thing to remember is that, you know, this is New York. There's a million things happening. There's a million neighborhoods. Mike's experience, my experience, Legs' experience, Fab Five Freddy's experience, they're like little microcosms, and you can take us out of our particular context, which is a world. I mean, my world was the Lower East Side and CBGB's, and watching the incredible musical scene grow out of there, kind of untouched for a couple years until it got discovered, at which time it turned into Punk Magazine. You know, my experience of CBGB's is that at the beginning there was 8 or 10 different bands, all really different from each other. You know, they didn't have motorcycle jackets. Only one of them did, the Ramones. And they had a template of music that became punk rock. But to me, for me, always punk was a spirit, a kind of attitude in which you really thought that you were the first person to discover what it was you were dealing with. You were the first person to plug in an electric guitar and turn it up to 10 and surf that feedback. That really is the exciting moment, and you know, you can't take these things necessarily out of the context of being in New York, which is a huge world capital in which every idea known to humankind flows through and becomes part of this incredible melting pot. You know, I was really influenced by the Max's Kansas City scene of the late 60s, the Andy Warhol scene, the Velvet Underground, which I was too young to participate in, but when I got to New York, I was really sure that I was going to become something, you know, a writer, a musician. You know, you plug yourself in and you find your people. What I always like about New York, and in the 70s, maybe it was a little more apparent because the neighborhoods, the ethnic parts of the neighborhoods hadn't changed that much. You could still go down the Lower East Side and the Ukrainians were still there. It was still hugely Hispanic. You know, when they talk about gentrification, mostly they talk about, you know, things becoming blander and more cosmopolitan and generally whiter. But the fact of the matter is that wherever you go to the fringes, you're going to find lots of different ethnic groups that are functioning and kind of interbreeding. That famous $30 apartment on Avenue D, well, the only reason why you could get a $30 apartment on Avenue D is because it was a war zone, same as down in Clinton Street, Suffolk Street, all these places, but that doesn't mean that suddenly these war zones don't exist. I mean, you know, I'm watching Brooklyn. I grew up a lot in Brooklyn in the 50s. I went to Ebbets Field and saw the Dodgers, by God. You know, I'm watching Brooklyn all of a sudden become a location for people who are now moving to New York. Bushwick is opening up, you know, a thing of, you know, great amazement to people who see this developing thing. But New York is only 200-some years old. You know, it started out down at the tip of Manhattan. It had to get populated. This rapid change or gentrification, it's all the time. You know, 20 years, I lived for a long time on the Bowery across from CBGB's. And when my daughter was 3, we're driving, I'm wheeling her stroller down, you know, the Bowery, and there's a guy lying in front of the Bowery Opera Theater. What is that place called?
Amato?
It's across from the Amato, that really nice building. Anyway, this guy's lying on the street. He's got a knife in his, you know, thing, and my car is stolen 3 times off of 2nd Street. And I'm thinking, this is rough. And, you know, now you go there, and it's the new Gold Coast. I personally don't ever remember New York being that cheap in the 70s, because whatever apartments went for, I was $25 or $30 below that. And, you know, I was, you know, everything is relative. You hear $25 you know, a month. Well, if you're making $15 a month, that's a lot. You know, it's I don't really see, in a way, New York as being that different in the 70s than it is now. You just got to find it. And maybe the Manhattan itself is kind of gentrified, but New York is a big place, and always these kind of interactions are going on. Is that rambling enough?
No, it's pretty rambling. Well, you know, I mean, when you're young, you know, it's so people say like things used to be better when you were younger. I mean, well, of course they're better when younger. Like, you know, didn't have arthritis, hair was good, you know, whole thing. But of course it's better then. But I mean, maybe we could have a talk about, because I think there's this kind of definite feeling of nostalgia for this time, which, you know, well, at least off the surface of it, was not the best of times, you know, even though we liked it. So, and what really was, I mean, when you look at 42nd Street, it was the perfect situation. I mean, this is the main street of the town. You couldn't leave it like that. You couldn't leave it like the way it was, you know, with every single other places, like some blowout XXX place. Oh, and actually, one time I did this piece about 42nd Street. The premise was I would buy every single drug that was offered to me, and then I would take it to a laboratory to find out like what was really in it, you know. And it was like I feel I can't get arrested because I didn't buy any drugs. So, but because it was all fake. But anyhow, maybe the panelists could meditate for a second on you know, this sense of like the 70s or a time like that where like really felt like the first day of the new earth, and compared to now where everything seems to be, especially at least in Manhattan, I agree with you completely about Lenny about Queens and the Bronx are just kind of, they're fantastic to me. But I mean in Manhattan mostly, I mean it just seemed to be filled in, you know, in a lot of ways with not necessarily things that you would have filled it in with if you had your choice. And maybe people could talk about the past and the current situation, and sort of instead of just taking the line like, well, it's horrible and it's all like Disneyland, which is maybe true, maybe not. But
I'll jump in here. In the late 1980s, I made a film with Mary Herron for the BBC called The Last Days of Times Square. And in that, I interviewed a guy, his name was Harold Conrad, who Mark did a great piece on Esquire called The Coolest Guy in the Room. And
in this book, go on.
yeah, and is it in the book?
It's in the book.
Oh, it's in this book. It's really a good piece. And Harold was talking about Times Square, you know, in the 40s, you know. Harold was this 80-year-old guy who'd done everything in the world, you know. He had promoted Muhammad Ali, and he was there when he had to tell Malcolm X to get lost, and, you know, stuff like that, you know, because they were going to shoot Ali in the 70s because he became a Muslim. But now we just go and bomb Iraq. But Harold was talking about this, like going to the Copa with, you know, Bugsy Siegel and people like that. And I was thinking, wow, you know. And I think everyone always gets this great time in New York, you know. And I think for a lot of us up here, the 70s were, you know, are that magical time when we thought, as Lenny said, that we were doing things for the first time, you know, and it really felt great and we were all excited and stuff, you know. But that's because it's our time, you know. I mean, if there's young kids now, I mean, you're probably having a great time in New York, talking on your cell phone and, you know, listening to your iPod and talking about Milano Blahniks or whatever you're talking about, you know. I don't know what you're talking about, but, you know, I think your time is probably, you know, you're probably having a great time, right? I mean, we had a great time.
Daughters are here. I mean, Jake's daughters are here. They're the happiest kids in the world.
Yeah.
Are they really?
Yeah, they're great kids. These
Yeah.
two daughters out there.
So I don't think it's us versus them. We're just here to sitting around the campfire telling old 70s stories.
Well, I didn't have such a great time in the 70s, really. I don't know what these people are talking about. I remember in 74, before you moved to my apartment for a while, I was living on 24th Street, and there was a fire in the basement. The boiler blew up. And this is in the middle of winter, and as a result, we had no hot water, so all the pipes froze, and that meant all the pipes leaked. And we had to live there. The landlord blew up the boiler so he could get rid of all of us and drive us out so we could renovate the building and sell it to the yuppies who were moving in. And I remember living on East 3rd Street for a while across from the Hells Angels. That was horrible. They were riding their motorcycles at 3 o'clock in the morning all the time, keeping me awake. And then something even worse came. They started to visit me. They wanted to be my friend, so I had to move out of that place. I was afraid to go to CBGB's in the beginning because it was a Hells Angels bar. And you were brave or stupid enough to wear a leather jacket in that place, where Hells Angels would stomp you if they didn't like what was on the back of your leather jacket. I've always been curious if Lenny had some good stories about playing CBGB's back when it was a biker bar. So
It was just, what I always liked about CBGB is it was a nothing bar. It was really in the middle of Nowheresville. You were playing, the bands played to the other people in the bands for at least the first couple of years. And to me, that was a really great thing because it gave everybody time to develop their thing, whatever their thing might be. You know, television had all those great guitar symphonies, and you know, Talking Heads had that kind of psychotic preppy thing, and you know, it gave the scene a place to hibernate because it was so off the beaten path. I think the motorcycle people just were there for, you know, really a little bit. It was mostly Hilly and his pack of dogs in the back.
I remember some real violent fights in there, but I guess that wasn't at the nights that you guys played.
No, we were peace, love, man. We're old hippies, you know. But the fact is that the best thing about CBGB is that it was off the beaten path, and I think that's sometimes where it's good to have things develop because they stay out of the glare. Most of the bands there, even if they had commercial aspirations, were, you know, very far from what was considered mainstream rock at the time, and so there was time to get better, to learn how to play your instruments, to learn who you are and what you were trying to accomplish. And so when it all kind of burst in a moment when the music and the culture needed this kind of sound, and I'll leave it to the graduate students to analyze that, it was ready. It wasn't, you know, preformed, and you know, that to me was really great. If the bikers kept people out for a while, that was a good thing. But I don't remember them being there for for too long. Or they were, you know, they're nice. They were just Hell's Angels.
I just wanted to add, I'm thinking about a lot of things going back and forth I've been hearing. I just got to say that I remember the blackout in '77, and yeah, it was like Christmas in July, and I remember it was a very, very hot day, and you know, in Bed-Stuy, I remember people were using, it was like a heat wave, in fact, and people were using a lot of air conditioning, and they would have what they would call brownouts, where the city, you'd see the street lights dim a little bit, and it had been going on a few days prior, and I remember it was like late afternoon when the street lights were about to come on, but they were flickering, and we were watching that, and next thing you know, as it got dark, you know, there were no street lights, and traffic, intersections were crazy. And I'm from Brooklyn, so a lot of stuff he talked about. When you were talking about Broadway, we were talking about Bushwick, where that block was, that stretch was completely devastated.
200,000 people stealing.
Yeah. My crew made it up there, and we got a few things. I remember guys in my neighborhood had hit the local supermarket and had quite a bit of meat, and they were coming home with like shopping carts full of steaks and stuff. But the lights didn't go on until midday the following day, and with no refrigeration, those steaks all went bad. But I also want to add another really interesting fact in terms of where I was. You know, that was the kind of the beginnings of what became hip-hop. It wasn't known as hip-hop until way later, actually, but you know, the disco movement had been a big thing. It was a big part of the 70s, but before it became a thing that everybody wanted to hate on, disco was a thing where street DJs in my neighborhood and other areas of the city came out and played their music at block parties. The whole idea of 2 turntables and a mixer and keeping the music going was like an amazing, like, development, like supersonic revelation, where if you guys, anybody old enough to remember when you'd stack a bunch of records and the arm would swing and the records would drop down, and that's how most parties happened. But that disco thing was going on, and it was becoming the coolest thing to happen in the streets, and everybody wanted to be a DJ. It was before guys really began to rap and tell stories. And I'd go to those block parties and go to those park jams where guys would break open the bottom of the street light and plug in their sound systems, and the parties would go on into the wee hours of the morning, kept a lot of kids out of trouble like myself. But in '77, when that blackout hit, the amount of DJs in New York increased tremendously, especially in the Bronx, because cats that wanted to be DJs, you know, you needed the equipment, which cost a fortune. So immediately after the blackout, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of new DJs, particularly in the Bronx, and that actually elevated and advanced this whole form now known as hip-hop.
I mean, youth will always assert itself, right? I mean, that's the wonderful thing. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you know, it's great.
So do we miss the 1970s, huh? Do we miss it?
I miss it, yeah.
I thought you said you hated it.
Well, I was terrified at the beginning, but then when the CBGB scene got running like full on, 76 to 78 were great. But before 76, when I was struggling, I mean, you know, like Charis, the place I was talking about before with the cheap rent, they were firebombed by people in the neighborhood who didn't like them more than once. They were driven out of that place. My friend who lived on Avenue D was forced out because people kept breaking into his apartment. I think I was, you know, robbed every apartment I had back then. The crime we had in New York was beyond the pale.
It gave anarchy a bad name. No, it did for a while. I mean, it got a little out of hand. I mean, it got so bad that people actually liked Rudy Giuliani.
That's true. I mean, Rudy Giuliani was born in 1974 as a savior of the city, even though he didn't even know it at the time, I think.
You know there's a guy, he used to go to Bishop Laughlin, he'd go from the train to Bishop Laughlin. You know there's a guy that took his lunch money every day, and that guy
That's right, that's
ended
right.
up being responsible.
Well, I think
He remembered every single time, I'm sure.
I think gentrification began with Mayor Koch and his pooper scooper law. Because it was the beginning of the cleaning up of New York, you know, it wasn't acceptable to step in shit anymore, right?
Actually, I remember
It was amazing.
one of my Nat Hentoff was a guy I used to work with at the Village Voice. My image of Nat was that he'd be walking down the street, and in the traditional New York sense, he never learned how to drive a car. And Jack Newfield doesn't know how to drive a car. Jimmy Breslin doesn't know how to drive a car. Murray Kempton never drove a car. And Nat would be like reading the newspaper or whatever he's reading, and like doing this with his foot to get the dog crap off. And that was like my image of him. But that was 1973. Can I ask that? Yes, go ahead.
Let's see, this might be a little academic, but that's what I do. And I was struck by something Lex said about it seemed like an empty movie set. And what I'm trying to do is to connect, and there have been a couple of specific connections and examples made, but I mean, upping the ante a little bit. What I think is a kind of a stop-time quality about the 70s. I mean, from my perspective, looking at the long flow of New York City history coming out of the Second War, the long boom really peaks somewhere around 69 for a whole variety of reasons. And it kind of begins to sort of nose itself down until a conjunction of things in 73 and 74 drive the economy, not just here, but globally, over a cliff. You've got the oil shock, you've got the end of the loss also of the Vietnam War, you've got the devaluation of the dollar, and you've got now full-scale global recession. And from my sense of it is that an epic, this long post-war epic, stops in 74. It's a real caesura in time. And that it kind of stays bottomed out through much of what we think of as the 70s. We don't usually think of 71 as the 70s, what we're talking about here. We're talking about from the crash through the end, at least of the decade, and when there's a kind of a quasi-revival. I think the revival, in fact, of the 80s is a kind of a semi-phony one, a very limited one, that, in fact, the economy doesn't really deeply recover. What you get is this huge boom on Wall Street and a lot of paper shuffling and trading of assets and mergers and acquisitions. But that is enough to ignite a boom in Manhattan, south of 59th Street, with a real estate correlative, which is the gentrification stuff that we're talking about. And I just think it's very intriguing that there's this incredible explosion of creativity from, you guys, coming in that little window there when, in fact, something ends and something hasn't begun again. But you can't read off mechanically from macroeconomic swings to cultural development, but something's going on there, and I don't know enough to know what those ligaments are, what those connections were, what the sense of possibility is. because it's in fact a horrible time. I mean, let's remember the bankers take over the government. They put an end to a 50-year stretch of sort of basically a social democratic municipality. They freeze welfare, so the rate of poverty in the city explodes from before the 70s to after the 70s, even into the putative, wealthy 80s. In fact, New York is a much overall poorer city than it was before going into that. It was, to be crude and simple-minded, it was class war on a colossal scale in the mid-70s. And I think Reagan, in fact, picked up pretty much his entire program and much of his key personnel from what happened here in the fiscal crisis. Arguably, I would push this, that the IMF, which then begins to apply fiscal austerity programs on a global scale, in fact, worked out a lot of their operations here in New York in the 70s. So what I'm trying to get some clarity on, to the degree it's possible, are the linkages between that kind of large epical sense of this moment and this kind of feisty, generative stuff that's going on here and there around town.
Well, I think,
There's no money. There's no money, so you're free to. There's no structure and no money.
well, it was also
Free to
the,
invent yourself.
the end of white flight, everyone had this dream of moving to the suburbs and, get fresh air and stuff. And John and I grew up in the suburbs, and we didn't want any part of that, I mean, it was just a nightmare, It was like our parents' dream was our nightmare, And I think when we came to New York, and I described it as being an empty movie set, I think we really reached 74, 75, kind of the bottom out of everyone moving out. And no one, you got to also remember that New York City, the crime, you could see the crime every week on shows on like Kojak, where they shot all the exteriors in New York and shot all the interiors in Hollywood. And everyone would say, John and I grew up about an hour and a half from New York, and no one would ever dream of going to New York then. Now they all come in to go to see, this horrible Broadway stuff. But it was great because they were all saying the crime, And I always felt completely safe here. I mean, I was drunk through most of the 70s, so, but I mean, I always felt, like, people had knives and guns and stuff, but they didn't have, like, the machine guns and the crack wars in, like, 85, That's when I started getting a little scared. But, I mean, if you kind of kept out of their way, they wouldn't, I don't know about John getting robbed all the time, but I don't ever remember getting robbed or mugged or anything.
That's because you got robbed and you just don't remember.
Yeah, probably.